Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome to the American Journal of Sexuality Education lecture series. My name is Bill Taverner, and I am the chief editor of the journal, and thank you for joining us. Before we get started, we have a few announcements. I'm pleased to remind folks that we are partnering with the Tennessee Alliance for Sexual Health, or TNASH, to provide AASECT continuing education credits for this session. If you have already signed up for CEs, you will receive an evaluation within about a week after the session, and then please give TNASH up to 2 weeks to process and send you your AASECT certificate. If you haven't signed up for AASECT CEs, you're welcome to sign up after the fact. There will be instructions in the automated email after the session. Thanks again to TNASH for providing them. I'm pleased to welcome my friend and my colleague, Tanya Bass, who will be handling moderation. Hello, Tanya. And Tanya is going to say a few words about Q&A and the chat functions.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Bill. Yes, there is a chat box, and I actually just posted a comment to ask folks to just share where you're zooming in from on tonight. I'm zooming in from North Carolina. Please say hi to each other, network, share ideas in the chat. But if you have a question, we really like to ask you to utilize the Q&A box, and Bill and I will do our best to monitor that for our speaker tonight. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight. Our speaker is Stephanie Mitelman, and Stephanie has been a part-time faculty member at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec for the past 18 years, where she teaches courses in sexuality, diversity and relationships, communication, and family life education. She is a member of the Order of Sexologists of Quebec and is the only sex educator in Montreal certified by AASECT. Ooh, AASECT certified. Stephanie is the owner and creator of Sneeze Pillows, hope I'm saying that correctly, a company making vibrating pillows for people with sensory needs, and Sex Ed Mart, a sex education publishing and distribution company specializing in sex education for youth with special needs. She is tonight's speaker on the ABCs of sexuality education and autism. Welcome, Stephanie, and we turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to publicly thank Bill for the invitation to be here with you guys tonight. And thank you, Tanya, for helping to moderate. It's such an honor for me to be with other sexologists and with other educators and other professionals to be able to talk about this subject this evening with all of you. I also heard that registration was pretty great on this particular workshop, so I am thrilled that people are interested in wanting to talk about sexuality education where autism is concerned. So certainly this has been a subject that has grown in popularity and in interest, and I think, you know, tonight's sort of turnout shows that. So before I go any further, on my screen I'm seeing Tanya right now. I just want maybe a thumbs up or let me know that this is working well and everyone can hear me.
And you all can use the chat, but we hear you just fine if you want to.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, great. I would hate to get to the end, and I'd love to tell you a little bit about myself and how I sort of got into this field, and then we're going to jump right into the information. So, you know, discussing both sexuality and autism are topics that can go on for days on their own, and we have about 45 minutes tonight. So we're going to do a condensed version, and I certainly will leave you with tools, but I wanted to just share with you that I have been a sexologist for about 22 years. As was said, I'm a member of the Order of Sexologists of Quebec, and there is my Made in Canada sticker at the top. So I am from Canada, and I'm located in Montreal. So please let us know in the chat. I was seeing all sorts of, you know, beautiful cities. I didn't see anyone from Canada go by. So if you're, you know, there, let us know too. That would be great. I'm one of the founders of the Planned Parenthood of Montreal, which is now called the Sexual Health Network of Quebec. I've been part-time faculty for a number of years, and I have developed curriculum for a number of years to help teachers really do sex education in sort of a fun and interactive way in the classroom. And the area that has really come to my attention needing the most sort of support in the last sort of 5 to 10 years has really been the area of special needs, and certainly talking about autism and autism spectrum disorders. So we're going to talk a little bit about resources and sort of, some of the tools that I have developed for my own use, as well as other teachers and practitioners, so that you guys can have a little bit more information on what is out there at this point. I also would like to say that I'm a mom, actually, to 3 children. I have 2 beautiful stepdaughters in their 20s, and I have one biological son who does have special needs, and he was diagnosed with autism when he was 2 years old. And I share that because I think it's important to some extent that people know that I talk about this subject certainly from a professional standpoint, and having worked in special needs for a lot of years, and even prior to my having my own son. But I also talk about this subject from a place of love and as a parent, and I have a tremendous amount of passion for this area. And I also get really excited when other people want to learn more about autism as well. So I think we're quite a few people on the call tonight, but my hunch is probably about half of you, probably if not more, know a tremendous amount around sexuality and sex education, and are probably, seasoned sex educators, which is, such an honor to be with you guys tonight. But you may have been working in special needs for years, or maybe you don't have a lot of information about autism and want to get more of that tonight. And on the other side, we may have, a group of people that have a tremendous amount of information around developmental disorders or differences and autism, and may not have had the opportunity to work in the area of sexuality very much, and to gain more knowledge in that area. So we're all going to come at this from different places, and where sexuality and autism intersect isn't often in terms of the profession, right? It's often in terms of life, but not in terms of the profession. And the other thing I want to speak to as well is that even in the last 10 years when working in this area, there has been a huge jump in the amount of information that has come to, practitioners' ways and educators, sort of ways. There's a tremendous amount of information that is shared from those who themselves identify as being autistic or on the spectrum around sexuality, and sharing of their own experiences. So sort of anecdotal evidence, if you will. A lot of information has been learned from that, modality, but there's also been more of an investment in terms of understanding or developing or investing in research as well in this area. So what I want to make a disclaimer about now is that what we know today is what we know today. In other words, I think this is a very sort of new field, understanding how neurodiversity or any sort of diversity, and that could mean autism, that can mean ADHD, that can mean Tourette's, there's sort of a whole range or spectrum of neurodiversity, how this affects sexuality, sexual experiences, our desire, arousal, sensory systems. I think we're only at the beginning of understanding all of this. So I'm very happy to share with you what I know today and some resources for teaching individuals, but I also want to make it clear that I think things are going to change in the next few years. I think that we're going to learn more as we go on. So I call this the ABCs of sexuality education for youth with an ASD. ASD stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder, and we're going to get into a little bit of what that means. But the A and the B and the C for me means an awareness or attitudes about sexuality, autism, and development in sex education. So we all have, a range of awareness as well as a range of attitudes. I think most of us are familiar with, sexual attitude reassessments and, what our feelings are around sexuality, autism, and so on. So we take a look at those. We also take a look at behaviors, right? So the truth is that if you've met one individual with autism, you have met one individual with autism. And by that, I mean that, there are some commonalities there in terms of how things might be processed or the communication skills. And we'll look at those in just a minute. But there's also such a huge variability, right, which I think can be said across many different groups. So we may see some behaviors that might be common, but there's also a tremendous amount of variability there as well. And the C stands for communication and connection. And now autism at its core is a communication disorder or difficulty. And of course, communication is one of the things that, we're always talking about needing in intimate relationships, for dating and for flirting and for, initiating relationships and maintaining relationships. So this is one of those areas of difficulty. And certainly if we're working with those with special needs or with autism, we're really going to want to focus on the communication aspect to help those to be able to initiate relationships as well as maintain them. And that, of course, is closely connected to connection. And so I think that as a community of, health professionals and helping professionals, I think we're learning more and more about the importance of connection. And I want to just stop here for a second just to think about our own assumptions, because a lot of people make assumptions about individuals. All individuals, for example, want sex, or all individuals need to be in relationships, or all individuals want a certain kind of relationship, for example. And I think it's really important that we're clear that we need to be where our clients or our students are. In other words, there's a whole bunch of, myths that surround those with autism and their need for sexuality or connectedness or relationships that spans from very little to thinking about this all the time and everything in between. Again, it's very much similar to what we will see in the general population, but because individuals have special needs, there's often this sort of set of myths that surround it. We need to be where our clients and students are. In other words, if students want a relationship, then our role would be to, and they're of course of consenting age, there are laws around consent, but then our role would be to help support them. There are also individuals, like in the general population, who will have no interest in having a relationship. And so again, our role would be to help support that. So our role would never be to, try to convince someone to have a relationship if they showed no interest in that, or to deter them, which may be more common in this area, that if someone is showing interest or desire to have a relationship, that we would go in there and sort of deter that. So for those of you who have worked in the area of autism, I think that this would probably be pretty evident to you, but there are some people who have not worked in this area, and there are a lot of myths around autism. So I thought it would be important to sort of start off here talking about autism and abilities. First of all, people can be diagnosed with autism at any age. Because the tests are more sensitive now or more elaborate, then we're seeing the diagnosis happen at younger and younger ages. So children can be diagnosed as early as 1 or 2 years old. What's much more likely is around in between 3 and 5, when there's social interaction happening at preschool and school-age children. And then there are also individuals in their adolescence and adulthood who are also being diagnosed sort of later in life. One of the myths, however, that is included with those with autism is the fact that this is a learning disability or an intellectual disability. And I want to make it very clear that certainly there can be an intellectual disability or delay that can coexist, if you will, be comorbid to autism, but at its core, that's not what autism is, right? And I think this is important to understand if we're going to be developing programs and working with resources that are helpful for this population. So in terms of autism, I think it's important to understand that there is a number of ability levels, just like we will see in the general population. So an individual can have autism and they certainly can have an intellectual delay. An individual can have autism and they can be typically developing. And an individual can have autism and also can be gifted and talented. Okay, so we certainly see this full range. Sometimes people use terminology like higher functioning and lower functioning. I'm not a huge fan of that terminology just because, words have so much power. And I think what we're doing is sort of, setting up this idea that, some people have better skills or better abilities than others. And what tends to happen is those that are quote unquote labeled as lower functioning, there tend to be a lot of assumptions about what they can or cannot do and are sometimes left out of opportunities that otherwise they would be able to participate in. And then there are other people who sort of, are labeled, if you will, higher functioning that can just sort of slip under the radar, which means that you don't really see where that difficulty or where that struggle is. And so it's often forgotten about that it's that much more difficult for someone to achieve what it is that they're doing, or that they're struggling at all. And so I don't love that terminology. Yes, thank you. I'm seeing chats come in. There certainly is a power in words, but I think that we just don't have something else to replace it right now. And so if you have a better, set of terminology, please put that in the chat box, and I'd be very, very happy to share it out. So just a couple more pieces about autism so that we're all on the same page. Okay, a text just came in, high support needs and low support needs. I love that, Katie, thank you. That's really, really useful, higher and lower support needs, thank you. Bill, if we can go to the next slide, please, about understanding autism more, just so that then we can move into our sexuality stuff and understand, how we're going to adapt the materials and the content best for this population. Now, I'm aware that this is quite small, and I'm going to walk you through it. But what I wanted to show for you here was that generally the things that individuals with autism have in common is what's called the triad of impairments. And the triad really is sort of, three parts to a triangle. And the first has to do with language and communication. The second has to do with social impairment or development. And the last has to do with flexibility of thinking and behavior. So in terms of language and communication, we may think that those are the exact same thing. But however, language is usually the verbal is what we are talking about, and there can be difficulties in terms of expressive language as well as receptive or understanding it. And we'll get into that more in a moment. And then communication is sort of larger. Communication also includes both facial expressions as well as body language. Now, the great majority of individuals on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum, do have difficulty with understanding nonverbals. So I know I can't see you guys in this webinar, but if we were in the same room together, I would ask you something like this. Who's a good flirt? So usually people are giggling at this point. You guys can put in the chat box if you're good flirts. What I want to know is, how do you flirt, right? For those of us who are expert flirts, Tanya tries, thank you. So something like flirting, of course, is one of these, one of these entry points into connecting with someone else or signaling to them that there's interest at all, right? But it relies heavily on facial expressions and often body language. So this is one particular area where we can begin to start to see where the autism could potentially have an effect on individuals who want to connect with one another in this area, if that is their goal. It's an area that's hampered. The good news is that we can teach this stuff, and we're going to talk about how to do that. So generally people, sort of pick up stuff on their own, or we can teach it, right? And as sexuality educators, we can teach this stuff. Social development has to do with things like, how do I make conversation? How do I get in there? How do I, make friends? What are the skills needed for social interaction? The back and the forth, the small talk. Most people don't love small talk, some do. But, we do it anyways because, it's sort of, the social graces, all those social graces, that have to do with social development. Most of the time, we're just picking them up by watching, by referencing other people. But that's not necessarily how everyone learns. And certainly those with autism can sometimes find that part challenging. And now the last triad of difficulties of flexibility of thinking and behavior. And sometimes we might see a repetitiveness here. We might see sort of a rigidity or repetitiveness in thinking, or sort of getting stuck on thoughts. And what we do know is that there are some other things that are also very likely to be traveling with autism. So the first is sensory processing. Okay, so sensory processing has to do with how we take in information through our senses. Now, we don't have enough time tonight to go over all of that, but most people think that there are 5 senses. There's actually 7, and there's discussion about an 8th as well, which is how our body receives information about about the senses, and certainly sexuality, whether with yourself or with someone else, is one of those areas that we get a lot of information, or all of our information, through really our senses. And it's one of the activities, other than the only other thing I could think about would maybe be skydiving, but I'm not even sure about that. But that where, all of the senses are sort of, activated at the same time. I'm going to be giving a talk actually for the STAR Institute, the Society for Sensory Processing Disorders, on sexuality and sensory, coming up in October, which is going to be a full 2 hours just on senses and sexuality, if anybody would like more information on that. Autism and anxiety are also connected a lot of times. So it's like 85% of individuals who are on the spectrum also have a clinical diagnosis of anxiety. So anxiety is something that we're seeing more and more across the board. We're seeing it more and more, certainly across, the last few months of this pandemic. But it's something that travels with autism as well, because autism is a difficulty in understanding social language, really, and our world is social. So those things, go hand in hand. A lot of individuals also have a comorbid aspect with OCD. Those things are not exclusive, but they can, certainly travel together. And a lot of individuals with autism may get what I call sticky thoughts into their head. So thoughts that sort of get in and that are difficult to get out of the mind. I'm seeing some chats come up. Just to let you know, I have sent this PowerPoint slide or this presentation to Bill, so everybody has access to that. And there's also a couple handouts that I thought would be useful as well that I've sent to him, and I'll point those out when we get to those slides. Just to finish up with understanding autism, there sometimes can also be depression, because sometimes individuals, really want to be social and are not sure how to go about that. And sometimes there can be issues around body image. And I think more information is coming out these days around body image. There's much more research around this, but there's a link now between eating disorders, or that's being shown, eating disorders and body image, and those with autism, particularly in females, is where a lot of the research is coming out as well. And we know that there's a difficulty in understanding social and sexual cues. And so, that's one of the areas we'll certainly want to focus on, and as well as emotional regulation. So sometimes, the part of the brain that regulates emotions in individuals with autism may be slightly different. And so the emotions may sort of come on, or it feels like out of nowhere. The usual signs you might see in somebody who is getting angry, may not necessarily be there. And sometimes that sort of, once there is anger or a strong emotion that comes in, it could take a little bit more time to repair afterwards. And now, given that emotions are such an important part of intimacy, we see where we need to really focus some of our efforts. Okay, let's get into the sexuality stuff a little bit more, for those of you who have been patient and waiting. And by the way, I'm wondering, can people see me and the slides right now? Because all I see on my screen are the slides. So I'm wondering, if my hair needs to be neat or not. Oh, yes. Okay. So don't do anything strange. Got it. Okay. We can see both. Lovely hair. Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. So getting back to autism. Okay, so people with ASD may need more detail on things like social cues, body autonomy. So, if that's not clear for people, this is my body and who's allowed to see it, who's allowed to touch it, and in what ways. Certainly puberty, hygiene. There's a really great book out there by Mary Roble called Taking Care of Yourself, which has a great focus for those with autism on exactly those kinds of things, puberty, hygiene, and sort of taking the reins of exactly her title, taking care of yourself, but being autonomous. Consent and reporting, right? So who's allowed to see you and who's not, and how. Just to stop here for a moment, one of the ways that I teach about touch is, and I don't know if this is familiar to people or not, but in the past, we've often taught it in terms of good touch and bad touch, and I'm sure that would be familiar to people. But one of the things that we found throughout the years was that this notion of bad touch was something that was quite confusing for a lot of people, because if somebody is touching your genitals when they shouldn't be, and it would be considered a bad touch, it may still tingle and tickle and feel good. And so there was a lot of shame and secrecy that grew out of this for individuals. And so the shift in the way that I teach it now for just about everyone, and I think almost all of these subjects you'll see here are going to be subjects that we should be teaching everyone, but I'm really highlighting for those, with autism more. I teach this now in terms of, what's a good touch. So it's things like, fist pump and a high five and a handshake, although not in the time of COVID, but, removing COVID, what a good touch is. But that more importantly, a secret touch is a touch that somebody will touch you and then will always say, shh, it's our little secret. So if somebody has consent or permission to touch you in a sexual place or way, it isn't a secret. And so I teach people that those who are saying it's a secret, that's when we go and tell. Of course, I think it's really important everybody knows who their safe adult is. This is something else also that's important in terms of working with this population and just about any population, but they know who they can go and speak to. With this population, and we don't often do it with sort of, other youth, though, is privacy. So sort of private versus public. So what's a private place versus a public place? This is something I spend a fair bit of time on, understanding what's private and public, because as we'll see, this group tends to be very, very rule oriented. And most of the time when somebody with autism breaks a rule, it's usually because I didn't know the rule was there, right? So this really is an issue a lot of times around common sense. But a lot of times as adults, we are not giving the full picture, or people are following exactly what we're saying, and we ourselves are not necessarily being very clear. One example of this might be that we tell people, for example, that they can only self-touch or masturbate in a bathroom. I've seen this happen so many times. And so the intent is quite good, right? We want to, set it up that self-touch is positive and can be pleasurable and is entirely okay to do, but you need to be in a bathroom. The assumption being that you're going to be alone, the assumption being that the door will be closed, the assumption being that no one else could see you. The problem is that for somebody who is a literal thinker, and the great majority of people with autism are quite literal, and they will take your word very often at face value. When you say you need to be in a bathroom, they are likely to be in a bathroom. The real difference is that, a bathroom at home doesn't necessarily compute as different than the bathroom at the McDonald's, or the bathroom at the Pizza Hut, or the bathroom at the church. And so this is the kind of call I'll often get, right? That somebody is self-touching in public, and often it's a very, very small tweak that they learned that the rule is you need to be in a bathroom, and they were in fact following the letter of the rule or the law, but they weren't taught the law in a very clear kind of way to begin with, right? So private and public. I think there was a chat I saw go by as well. I think it's really important that those that need help with toileting also sort of understand who's allowed to work with them, who's allowed to see them, who's allowed to help them with their clothing and toileting. And because there's such a range of people with autism, there are going to be individuals who do need help with supports and with caregivers and other workers that will involve, their genitals and help in some way. And there are those who will not. So we need to be sensitive to sort of the full range. I would also like to focus ASD information on issues around affection and gestures of love. We need to teach people, what is affection, what are different gestures of love. Personal space is really important sometimes, and everybody sort of has a different measure for this, but generally, I talk about it as sort of being an arm's length. Again, COVID changes this greatly, right? And we don't know what we're going to look like when we come out of this, but generally sort of, giving people personal space. There are a lot of sensory issues that people will have, and sort of speaking about those and also offering some solutions in the area of sexuality and intimacy. And sometimes it's as simple as, I've seen couples in my private practice. I work with individuals with special needs for private education, and I've seen couples before where I remember distinctly one female couple being very, very upset that her male partner wasn't kissing her anymore because she loved kissing, and she was visibly upset by this and crying. And it turned out that she had bought this new kind of lip gloss that was, very shiny, but also very sticky. And, maybe people can relate to this, a sticky lip gloss. It may not feel so bad to you, but her partner who was kissing her, it felt really abrasive to him. And he had a lot of difficulty with sort of the sticky sensation. And this is one of the sensory kinds of things. There are a lot of people that might have difficulty with stickiness anywhere. They were the kids that didn't like gluing when they were kids. And they were the kids that, had difficulty with any sort of texture that was sticky in their mouth, that didn't like sticky toffee or anything else that would stick together. And there are also going to be the people who are likely to grow up who are not going to enjoy any sort of sexual behaviors that involve a sort of level of stickiness as well. We got her to stop wearing that lip gloss, certainly around him, and the problem went away. So sometimes it's really just about communicating what those sensory kind of needs are and being present or mindful that there can be a difference in the way these sensory pieces of information are being processed. Any ASD program, I believe, really needs to focus on body language as well and facial expressions. And this is one of the things that I sort of start with and end with and are constantly working on, because not only in the area of flirting, but, most of what we do in terms of communicating our pleasure or displeasure or our attraction, our arousal, or our, being turned off, all these kinds of things are done very much so through facial expressions and body language. And individuals with an ASD tend to be poorer at this skill. But again, it's the kind of thing that we can teach. It's the kind of thing that we can really teach. And I have a number of, I'm going to introduce you guys to my website with a number of resources, but we do have sequencing cards around body language and facial expression that will show images of people's faces and bodies, and on the back label exactly what that individual is feeling or likely to be feeling by themselves and then in relationship to others, so that people can study these. Right? So whereas some people may pick up this kind of information intuitively, other people may need the benefit of sort of studying it in more of a static way, but then both can arrive at the same place in understanding this information. We also want to make sure that people with ASD have information around building friendships and who is a friend. This is one of the areas that's come to our attention a fair bit, sort of understanding the difference between a friend versus someone who's friendly. Right. So, sometimes people will act in friendly ways, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are friends. And that's one of the sequencing cards or educational cards that we have built in our special needs catalog. And then also, what's the difference between friends and partners? Right. So, why would you want a partner, or what are the kinds of things that you would do with a partner versus, someone who is a friend? Also, what kind of partner is someone that you are looking for, right? Who would be an ideal, partner for you. And then I also want to mention here too, that in this particular group, this is one of the areas of research that is coming out a fair bit, quite quickly actually, is that there's a lot of information now coming out around the connection between ASD and gender and sexual orientation and identities, sort of being more on a spectrum statistically than we might see in other populations or in sort of the general populations. In other words, there seems to be more of a fluidity here, right? So we will see a higher likelihood of individuals who identify as both trans and being on the spectrum. Now, I want to be very, very clear that I'm certainly not saying if you're on the spectrum, you're going to be trans, or that if you're trans, you're on the spectrum. What I'm saying is that we are seeing much more of a gender fluidity here in the population and more of a connection. And the same is showing in the research as well in terms of sexual identities and a fluidity around sexual identities as either, gay or straight or bi or pan. In other words, there's less focus on individuals choosing people based on their gender. It's more about choosing individuals, or it seems to be more about choosing individuals who they enjoy being with, regardless of gender. And so certainly that is not the case across the spectrum, but we do see it to be more noticeable in the research. And as I said before, more research is needed. And so, more is coming out all the time. Yes, hi Kayla, I see your text message here. There's some wonderful information and research going on, I believe, from some researchers here in Montreal. And so if you email me or Bill, I'd be happy to sort of get some of that information to you. Oh, thank you. This chat is so wonderfully interactive. And if you've been missing it, there are all sorts of references coming in. Thank you. Okay, this slide is very, very tiny, the text, and it was done on purpose. My apologies, but I have sent Bill a full, really visible copy of this, but I wanted to put it up for you just to say that you have it in your Google Drive or in his Drive or however, we access materials now. I've shared it out to you. I knew in the interest of time, I wouldn't have enough time to go over all of this and all the contents. But in a full training around working with those with autism, this is the kind of thing that I would go over in great detail. But what I wanted to highlight for you is that there are 6 main areas that I tend to focus on. And now, I don't know if you can see me squinting. I can't even see what the writing is. Oh my goodness. Okay, so building blocks, boundaries, the body, abuse prevention, privacy, and then healthy relationships. I did it. I was able to read off that screen. So again, I wanted to put this up and not spend too much time on it in the interest of time, but to make sure that you got this information, and it's in a much fuller handout that Bill sent you the link of. This is my suggestion of the building blocks that I believe, so the contents of a basic program that should be included. I want to be very, very clear that this by no means that there aren't other subjects that should come in. In fact, this list is not exhaustive, and this is sort of a basic list, if you will. There's probably 10 other things that could be added to each one of these areas. But if you were looking for a basic starting or launching point, this is what I would go to as sort of a checklist, and then you could fill in with your own, additions and expertise. Okay, I wanted to mention also that working with those on the spectrum, or really any students, we always want to have the right kind of images. Thank you, Laura. I'm glad that that was helpful as sort of a basic framework and checklist. We want to work with appropriate images. One of the difficulties that I've come across in this field, and you may feel the same way too, is that sometimes the images that we have seem to be just sort of either too babyish and that we lose people and they're, too beginner, or they are too advanced or explicit and then they're shocking, or we lose their attention, or even offensive at times to some people who may not want to see those images. So I put this up to say that we've created a number of images that we use that seem to work quite well, that are explicit enough, but not too explicit. And again, I think, there's a number of great resources out there that exist, but the images that we use are really important, really for any population, but especially for this population, because they tend to be very visual thinkers. So we'll get to that more in a minute. So just a couple more things when keeping in mind when you're working with individuals with ASD, they're just as diverse as the rest of the population. I just saw some chat come in about diversity in images. I really just threw up one image, but we've got images of females self-touching, males self-touching. It's certainly not just one. It was just the one that I chose to throw into this slide. So sorry about that. Awesome, great. Okay, so just to sort of round this out, I will get to that in a minute, Nia. I'm going to talk about, different resources. When you are working with those with ASD, just keep in mind a couple of key points, and some were already mentioned. There can be difficulty with social norms and rules. So a lot of times it's about the stuff that you thought you wouldn't have to say, just say it, right? Give the rules, be explicit, be straightforward. Sometimes there's a lot of need to spell out or work on nonverbals, especially when we're talking about sexuality and relationships, right? Facial expressions and body language, they matter, in everyday relationships, especially in special needs. And then also be careful when we're talking about language, there can be difficulties in the way that one understands semantics, pragmatics, so context and meaning, as well as prosody, which has to do with the intonation. Okay, so we want to just check in and make sure that people are understanding us the way that we are intended. Let's talk about language and intentions. So this one usually gets a chuckle when I, am in a room with people together. I've had to update this a little bit, mostly for the emojis now, which I just went into my son's He's 12. I went into his phone and saw which emojis were popular now, and they are the eggplant and the waters and the peach, which I will let you guys, sort of figure out on your own, and the donuts and the bananas and so on. We have all sorts of emojis now that mean things, but what I wanted you to get from this is that sex and sexuality certainly has a lot of meanings, and there are code words, and there are ways that we talk in sort of code words to mean certain things. This is a really difficult area for those with autism, because autism is a language barrier or language difficulty. So when you say, or somebody says the word blowjob, for example, they might visually think of. So for those of you who didn't see what I did, I'm literally just blowing out. And of course, that's not what the word blowjob actually means. So in this particular context, I think it's important that we give people, certainly our teenagers and the older, what the street slang is, so that they can be a part of the everyday talk and a part of the discussion, but that they're also clear on what else that means. So blowjob is anytime there's a connection between your mouth and someone else's genitals. In terms of blowjob, typically that is, male identified penis. Okay, typically. So, but it's your mouth to somebody else's genitals. We want to explain what that is because people don't always get what that is, and then meaning sort of goes by. So we talk about sex in very covert ways: banging, screwing. Screwing for somebody who's a literal thinker is screwing something in, right? So banging is, banging. So they're, quite literal. And of course, Bill, I don't know if you are on the slide with me and can hear me, but I put in home run just for you because I know that you are a baseball fan. So that one.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. That one is there for you. But the point is that we want to be clear and help explain to people what we're really talking about. So to that point, I also sent to Bill a cheat sheet that we've built that has been helpful for students, and we circulate it sometimes in our classes. It's a cheat sheet to just decode some of this social talk, if you will, in terms of sexuality. So Bill has got that with the contents of a basic program, and he sent you the link already. That's our version of a cheat sheet. You guys can add to it, change it, do what's needed. These cheat sheets are always sort of a slice in time and space. It's, what it means today, for example. Just so I can give you guys a little bit more information, we've also created a collection of handouts that I'm really proud of. So this is a collection of handouts that I have been using with my own students for probably the last 8 years or so, that span a whole range of subjects, whether it's body or privacy, dating, private and public, personal space. And we've made these available to you in sort of a manual that, you can download and use with your students. And now I want to talk a little bit about how to teach to strength. And I apologize if it seems like I'm picking up my speech. I am, because I'm aware of the time and I want to make sure to get a few pieces out to you before we sort of come to a close on the webinar. So one of the pleasures, and there are many, for working with individuals with special needs and with autism or an autism spectrum disorder, is that there tends to be an orientation towards rules. So people tend to be rule oriented, and this is something that we can use to our advantage as a strength while teaching. So if we, set rules around privacy, or we set rules around private behaviors, okay, or things we're allowed to talk about out loud or not talk about out loud, this tends to help. Another strength tends to be the logic. Right? If we use logic rather than emotion, emotion tends to be more the area of difficulty. Use logic to explain things, and that tends to get through much more because it often is a strength. Sequences, sort of an order of events. We started this, this is step 1, step 2, step 3, is really helpful and tends to be very sort of logical kind of way for people to envision all sorts of tasks. And we can use this for things like, how to use a condom. There are very distinct steps there. We can use this for how do you use menstrual pads or other, menstrual products. There are very distinct steps here. And there are a number of steps for a number of activities that have to do with the body and puberty and hygiene and sexual practice. And also, of course, use visuals. Now, most people are auditory. I think we know this from PowerPoint and Zoom and all sorts of stuff, but especially this group tends to be much more, sorry, I said auditory, I meant visual. Well, lots of people are both. This group tends to be more visual. And so, use pictures and drawings as much as possible. I'll show you one example that you can use visuals for just about anything. And so this was an example. These are the steps to using a menstrual pad. And you want to start off with showing the underwear and the pads and how to take them out of the package. All those steps involved, how to place it properly, and then how to dispose of the packaging or a soiled pad. There's always, a number of steps. And I'm certainly not saying the pads are the only method. I'm just, using this as one example. So we can use visual supports for menstruation, sexual behaviors, hygiene routines, body language, appropriate touching of ourselves or others, facial expressions, private and public, erections and ejaculation, and then self-touch made it on there twice. I was talking about appropriate touching. I guess it's a really important one. I put it on there twice just for effect. So we're going to look at resources in a minute. We do have this kind of stuff done because it's been stuff that I've used in my own practice. My team has used in their own practices, but this is also the kind of stuff that you can develop yourself as well. And, you don't have to be a professional photographer anymore to do a really great job with this sort of stuff. Okay, so just one more slide to go, pull it all together. I'm intent on finishing on time to honor those that have dinner plans or something afterwards. So pulling it all together, we certainly can do sex education for those with autism. We could do sex education for just about anyone. Yeah, I like that, appropriate touching to consensual touching. I love that term. Thank you, Barbara. That's a really, really great term. So appropriate, to consensual. Another term that I use as opposed to appropriate as well sometimes is expected, right? So rather than appropriate or inappropriate, it's something's expected or unexpected, but consensual in this context certainly works really well too. And this, of course, is the pleasure of working with other professionals tonight. So thank you for that input. Okay, so putting it all together, it's really important to speak at a learner's cognitive level. Sometimes we do want to give more pause and processing time. So say something and then just pause, right? We tend to talk really fast up against the clock a lot of times. We want to pause and be aware that some people need more time to process exactly what it is that you're saying. Be aware of language difficulties such as semantics and pragmatics and prosody. And subtleties like sarcasm. So that's not something that's going to be well understood for people on the spectrum. And there are so many examples of this. I mean, if you just think of a very popular show, The Big Bang Theory, that hasn't been on in a little bit, but Sheldon would get stuck in these areas. It was never fully disclosed that Sheldon, was autistic, but I think that was very clear to everybody within that sphere. Avoid using figures of speech like the birds and the bees. By the way, I don't know how birds and bees got all wrapped up in sex ed because there's no birds and there's no bees. So, those are just confusing, but they're confusing, especially for people who are visual thinkers and then, are not really able to tease out sort of, these kinds of subtleties and reading between the lines and figures of speech. So be as concrete as possible. Step-by-step instruction really helps, using those visual aids that we've talked about, and then scaffolding information. So that's where we get the little scaffolding there to the left. That's my little scaffold. And what we mean by that is, like with anyone, we want to make sure they've got the basics, and then we'll build on that. There's a foundation here about understanding privacy, private and public, and body autonomy, and safety, and boundaries, and consent, and how to say no, how to say yes, understanding our body parts, all these sort of things that a lot of times people are not taught, or the assumption is that people would just sort of get them at home. And sometimes they do. We know this as sex educators, and sometimes they don't. The other thing we, of course, want to watch out for is our own values when doing sex education, which wouldn't be new to you guys, but the values are different when we are working with other people's kids versus our own, right? So as parents, certainly our job is to pass on our values. As teachers, our job is to help people understand their values, to make decisions that work well for them, given, of course, that they are within the context of the law and consensual. So I'd like to end on the last slide. So I've been talking a little bit about the resources that we've put together, and my company for resources is called Sex Ed Mart. And I've been selling resources for about 15 years, maybe longer, to schools, mostly across Canada. And now I want to let people know that these are available as well. Much of what we do is available in print copy, but also now digital. And we have activity kits, which are games to play in the classroom. We have sequencing cards, which is mostly for special needs that we were talking about. There are learning cards, poster cards, and also teacher toolboxes, whether they are activity kits or they are card sets. Our area of expertise in the last few years, or really focus, has been on special needs. So we've got resources around, diversity, around healthy relationships to span, and sexual health prevention to span the whole gamut. But we also have an entire dedicated section for those working with special needs, autism, or, intellectual disabilities, which of course are different, that we covered early on in this presentation. And this summer we also just launched, which I'm super excited about, the Sex Ed Academy, which are specific trainings that are narrated PowerPoints with handouts and additional materials for classrooms on specific subjects, right? So dealing with sensory, or dealing with autism, or dealing with anatomy, or whatever the thing that you would like training on to be. And this is available certainly for practicing practitioners, but also teachers and parents. So to wrap it up, before I take questions, I would just like to say again, thank you so much to Bill and Tanya for your invitation to come and speak to this fabulous group tonight. And I hope I have shared, I finished on time, yay. I hope I have shared some global information around sexuality, sex education, autism, and then how to sort of, blend those things, and some resources to get started. So thank you. There's some beautiful text coming in, and I very much appreciate that. So at this point, because we are nearing or at the end, I'm going to pass it back over to Bill. And if anybody would like information, additional information from me, please feel free to get in touch either through info@sexedmart.com, or you can reach out to Bill and he knows how to reach me. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. We have a few questions, and I think I'm going to start from the beginning because I think you answered one, but I want to double check. The first question is, could you elaborate on your choice of language being special needs when referring to autistic people?
Oh, sure. I mean, special needs is usually just an umbrella term that is used in Canada, at least, to include anybody who's developed and sort of an outside of the typical sort of development. And that can include intellectual, that can include neurological, that can include physical. So it's sort of just an umbrella term to catch a number of individuals.
Thank you very much. It says that you mentioned that you teach one-on-one, and how does that arrangement work? And basically, how do you reach audiences that include a range of socioeconomic status, language needs, and racial identities?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer this properly, but I am the sexologist on staff at a clinic in Montreal that is called the Spectrum Clinic. So we cater for resources to those on the spectrum. So everybody coming to our clinic is on the spectrum, and then we've got a full range of individuals from all sorts of backgrounds. And we have psychological services, psychiatric services, speech therapy, physical therapy. There's all sorts of things. And then I'm the sexologist on staff for relationship and health. So that's how my client base has grown.
Awesome, thank you. And then another question is, do you think teaching rules enforces problematic language or culture? And then what are some of the ways we can navigate sharing information without being damaging?
That's a great question, but I feel like I would need a little bit more information on that. I think that words can always be problematic. So I don't think teaching rules is the problem. I think how we phrase them might be the problem. So I have found a lot of success with teaching about rules just because the individuals that I have met have been very rule oriented. So that's been a very, natural way to sort of understand social expectations or what is expected of individuals. So I don't think that's problematic, but it may be problematic in the choice of words at times. So I think that's where we need to be careful.
Awesome. And then we have two more. Looking at networking sheet, this is from Bar Girls, just wondering if folks in AASECT have had a special interest group for those wanting to network. What are your thoughts about creating that special interest group at AASECT?
That's such a great question. I'd love to. Yes, and sign me up. So I've said this twice now tonight. It's such an honor for me to be in a room with other professionals as well. And I'd love to continue working on that as well. And that's part of why I'm a clinic. I work at a clinic, at least for the private practice, because I think, especially on areas that are so new or, research is still constantly developing, we need to be able to talk to one another and we need to be able to bounce ideas off of one another. And so I'd love some sort of, AASECT group, and I'd love to be a part of that. So whoever starts this, please include me.
Yeah, and someone put into the chat, there's a sign-up sheet that people have been populating throughout the session for networking. So,
oh my goodness, wow.
Kayla, I think that was you who started it. If you don't mind dropping in the link for folks who may have missed it before, maybe more people would like to sign up for that.
Thank you. I can't believe how active the chat box has been throughout this. I've wanted to stop and read what everyone's writing and be a part of that. And I know I had to stay on target and finish on time. But I think it's beautiful how much people are interacting and excited about this subject. And that's what gets me excited, is that, I'm sharing this space right now with people who are also excited about this subject and these resources. So thank you. So,
Bill, I think those are all the questions, Bill.
And we're only a few minutes over. So no, that's fine. 7:05 has been, I should just, and when I'm listing the sessions, I should say that they all end at 7:05.
But then they're going to start to end at 7:10, right? So.
Someone was asking, what does YAI stand for?
There was a question that I just went ahead and answered in the Q&A box. It was about materials for measuring sexual consent capacity, assessing sexual consent, and I responded by both talking about something that I had co-authored with Christopher DeMarco called VISCAT, Verbal Informed Sexual Consent Assessment Tool, but I was also commenting on YAI, who has done some revolutionary work in this area, and may very well have something more current than what Christopher and I developed. YAI, that's the name of their organization. It used to be called the Young Adult Institute, but I think they go exclusively now as YAI. They're based in New York.
Yeah, they are. They're a great organization. I'm glad that you put that in the chat.
Thanks. And there's something else here from Barbara Gross. Talk SC was just revised within the last couple of years also. That's great. Is that an assessment tool? I'm not familiar with that. Oh, I love when my stuff becomes obsolete. It means people are doing great work in the field. Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise, and thank you everybody for participating in this session. Tanya, thank you so much for moderating. Just a reminder that TNASH does great sessions every week at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and so they have all kinds of speakers on sexual health. Just a reminder, I've said a few times that Tanya and Lori Ruleri and I are writing an article on how to adapt sex education during COVID-19. So we're welcoming people's thoughts. So there's a link right there. Just click that link, save that link. Where we've opened it up until September 30th to collect additional feedback. We have about 50 or so people who have weighed in with their thoughts, and we're really interested in what people are thinking about this. The webinar calendar for the lecture series is up through November, so you can browse that and see if other things interest you. There is a discount link. Please save the discount link if you need it. Please don't let money stop you from attending these sessions. And then next week is the topic is leading conversations about sexuality education with Dr. James Wadley. James is the author of, oh gosh, Tanya, help me here. What's the name of his book? It's a big manifest.
The handbook.
Handbook on Sexuality Leadership, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm a terrible promoter, not remembering the title of the book. But James compiled some of the great thought leaders on leadership in sexuality, not just education, but therapy and other disciplines as well. So he's going to be talking about leadership in the field next week. Stephanie, thank you again. Tanya, thank you again. And thanks to everybody, and be well.